Okay. So we've kind of already talked about this somewhat last Thursday, but I just want to kind of remind everyone what we're trying to understand is what is conflict? Okay, so we'll look at some examples, the impact it can have within the treatment group setting, and what triggers a conflict. And again, this is going to be a general overview, but when we look at the trauma-informed practices this coming Thursday, it'll be a lot more clear to what we're talking about. So, um, and what behaviors or reactions are demonstrated during a conflict? What is it that we do? And we're going to look at this from a biopsychosocial perspective, meaning we're going to look at the biological response of fight or flight response that we have, which is a very biologically based response. That's the biology end. We're going to look at the social end. How does it affect our social world? How does it influences social decisions we make? And then the psychological impact we'll talk about, again, specifically to that trauma-informed practices that we'll talk about this coming Thursday. Okay. And just similar to what we talked about last Thursday is kind of taking a little bit of a different view on what conflict is, okay? Because there's certain things that we need to take into mind. One, within conflict, it usually occurs when the stakes are really high, okay? Normally, conflicting attitudes or beliefs, if they're more on the lower or moderate level, so whether you like curly hair or straight hair, would be an example of low conflict, right? When we get to the moderate, it may be, making a decision on what the group should focus on that night. That's a moderate level of conflict. High level conflict usually occurs when there's two varying opinions, and this gets into bulletproof number two, is high stake situations is when two people have very strong emotions and very strong emotions. And this is really where conflict starts to play a role into the situation. The reason I bring this up is it's important for you as the facilitator or the psychotherapist to determine at what level of conflict are we at? Are we just at that low level? Is this a moderate issue? Or are all of these, the opinions are very strong, the emotions are very strong? And this is the other part about dealing with conflict between clients is you yourself have to know using the emotional intelligence stuff we talked about, the listening and attending, all of those skills to know what personal and emotional histories are getting in the way with coming to some resolution within a conflict. So if we talk about, for example, conflict between two people who have different opinions of a relapse situation, maybe one person thinks that the reason another person relapse is ridiculous. They should have been stronger. They should have done that. Knowing their both of their personal and emotional histories to understand why that was such a high conflict situation. And I know I've probably mentioned this story before in this class, but I'll go back to the story of when I was talking about trauma responses earlier in the course, and I mentioned when I was working for a women's and children's emergency center, that there were two women in there. One of them would trigger emotionally and personally to, I remember one of her nails got broken, where the other one who was very extremely abused in an acute situation didn't seem to have any trauma responses to anything. And the difference, though, and those two did conflict with each other. The difference are what was is their differences in experiences, okay, and their differences in their history. One had a long history of abuse, and so she didn't have the triggering that you usually would suspect. Whereas the first one, the first example, this was really her first history, her first introduction to being domestically abused by someone. Her history, there was no abuse with the family, the parents, even previous boyfriends, and I believe she was on her second marriage, but it didn't even, the first marriage didn't have any abuse within it. So, two different histories which explain why they had such conflict with each other, but also knowing those histories and knowing where they come from, it took a totally different response for both to resolve their issues with each other. Okay. And we also need to come to the understanding is are we dealing with a conflict or are we dealing with something else? So when we talk about a crisis, for example, we're talking about an acute situation that a person is in due to an event that happened that interferes with things like productivity and safety within a group. Okay. So when you think of crisis, crisis usually doesn't involve other people. Okay. Now it may, if abuse or trauma is occurring in the home, but it's a personal crisis. It's not a crisis that other group members may have experienced that creates then conflict between the group members. Okay. And but the important thing about crisis in the group setting is it can then result in conflict because someone may be having a trauma crisis response, maybe either completely despondent or they might be completely that kind of fight or flight kind of thing. So flight in that they're being reserved and quiet, fight abnormally, I should say. Fight is that they have a very aggressive stance about their story. Okay. And then again, going back to this personal history and emotional history and how the emotions are stirring up in the group, this may result in a conflict that could occur. Okay. Um, and so again, as a group facilitator, you want to manage those moments. So you want to be the person who is exploring first and then allowing the other group members to get involved in the conversation. Okay. So in this situation, when you notice someone is in crisis, usually, I should say, usually when there's not a crisis situation, you kind of say, so Jan mentioned that she went through this last week. She almost a relapse. What do you guys think about this? What could have she done differently? And you allow that. Okay. But if it's a severe crisis where there's strong emotions involved, this is where you kind of want to say, okay, Jan, this is what I hear you went through. Maybe here's some things that you could have done different. And then ask the group, what do you think about those things that are recommended that she could do different next time? That's called a facilitator-led conversation, where you seeded some potential solutions and then you handed it to the group. Okay. Whereas in the first situation, it's a group-led discussion about facilitation, I should say, about what should happen. Okay. A clash is also different than a conflict. Okay. This is when there's different opinions and apparent values that are at that moderate level. Okay. And the thing that I would encourage you to um, process, I guess is the word I would say, is that learn what is the difference between a moderate stake and a high stake situation. Because the thing that I see, especially novice group facilitators do, is they're very hyper vigilant and they take things always as a high stakes thing. They tend to see every little thing within the group setting as a high conflict situation. Okay. And again, this is where we want to use those skills of self-reflection and self-awareness. Am I reacting to this because of what it would make me experience? Okay. But with clashes, they will kind of wash away themselves in a sense, as long as you keep the group moving forward and the conversation moving forward, and not pausing and making it at a high stake conflict. Okay. And then we have things called blips that also can be misinterpreted as a conflict. These are no visible values in engaging. It has no or low impact, and the issues tend to be low stakes. So these are, again, my kind of ridiculous example was maybe one of the group members came in and she had straight hair or he had straight hair last week, but then they curled it and you don't like curly hair. Okay. I know it sounds like a ridiculous example, but that's what we call a no visible values, low impact situation. Other examples is somebody choosing not to drink coffee that night, and those types of more low impact. And again, this is where the facilitator just wants to continue with the group. Okay. So again, we want to look at these all at different levels to determine which way is the proper response. In the clash and blip situation, the facilitator wants to keep the group going, and then in the crisis a situation is when one, you either take it as either you facilitate the conversation if there's no instant conflict that comes between the group members, or if you feel like it's a moderate stake class situation, then no, in the uh, high crisis area, you want to facilitate the solution. Sorry, I got those backwards. In the moderate stake situation, you might want to have the group facilitate the conversation about what possibly the individual could do. Okay. And these are some things to, again, just keep in mind as you enter into a conflict resolution situation. One, you want to respond versus react. Okay. This one was probably hard, one of the hardest skills dealing with conflict that I had to overcome, is because when that conflict aroused, I got physiologically aroused. And so I reacted to the situation. And then later on, when I was calm and collected, I'm like, oh, I could have approached that this way. Okay. So the first part of empowering responses, empowering yourself in a lot of ways, is emotionally calming yourself. Again, that hold the breath in the throat and push it away kind of thing. And make sure that you're not reacting to a situation both physiologically and psychologically based on your own history, okay, and your own response to a crisis, okay. And again, determine what is at stake. Is this a high stake situation that could be destructive within the group setting? Is it a moderate one that may just need further conversation, either as the facilitator or as group members? And again, this is the important part about empowerment into the situation, understanding the history, both of the individuals involved, but also as the group. Okay, taking that group process into mind, the personalities that are involved. Okay, and again, the communication styles that they bring to the table. And so this is kind of, it builds off of the last slide. How do you then initiate the conversation? So very basic tools in addressing conflict is one, effective communication style on the facilitator's end. So some of the things that we'll be talking about, but keep in mind, I can't, and neither can a supervisor, train your specific communication style. This is something you have to learn. We can make recommendations, and through supervision, we can say, hey, try this next time. But you're going to respond differently based on who you are as a human being. You're going to respond differently if you're an introvert, meaning you need to think inwardly to get the solution, or extrovert, you need to talk it through. Are you neurotic, meaning basically high strung, or are you more of a calm person? Okay, so are you open or closed-minded? Okay, and so each of these dimensions are based upon you as an individual. Okay, so I encourage you to look at your personality factors and your interaction factors and build off of that. And if you need help, for example, there's books for introverts and extroverts about how you can use your personality to better communicate. And I would encourage you to look those up based on your unique personality. Timing really depends upon the physiological response of the individuals. If you're getting a more of a fight situation, meaning that instead of flight, meaning move away from the situation, they're starting to get intense and wanting to have almost a physical conflict. That's when basically you stop. You basically send each of them to a corner. I know that sounds silly, but I'll give you an example here in just a minute. And you take that time and let the physiological area parts of the room calm down. Again, and I know I've mentioned this before, this is one of the first skills they teach couples and couples counseling, is that one, there's high conflict between each other, and emotions start to get hardened and stop being able to communicate with each other. One goes to one room, the other goes to another. They do something that physiologically calms them down. Okay. Um, when they're more in the flight zone of physiological response, meaning they want to get out of the situation, they're shutting down. Okay, this is when you want to utilize that tool that we went through. There were several slides on it, called silence, and just letting silence appear within the conversation, and just letting them go back into themselves and reflect upon the things that are going on. And then after you've given a good 20 to 60 seconds of just quiet reflection, you as the facilitator use those reflective skills and say, all right, I want to start with Joe. Joe, this is what I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then going to Bob and saying, Bob, this is where I hear what you're saying, blah, blah, blah. Am I correct or am I not? And giving that opportunity to correct. And then facilitating that, navigating that dialogue that you've now created. Okay. Best and worst practices. Worst practices is when you get directly involved in the conflict. Now, we'll talk about when a client is in conflict with the therapist. So don't get me wrong, we're not innocent of this. I've seen some of the worst conflict happen between the therapist and the group member. So we will talk about this, but when we're talking about two individuals, you getting emotionally, psychologically, and biologically involved will really ruin the opportunity to get growth. out of this conflict. Because remember, conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you think about times that we grow and develop, it's usually out of conflict that we're having. Okay. Um, the other thing that you want to deal with is some consequences that might occur. So dealing with or ignoring the situation. Those are the two potential consequences, right? And when is it best to just move the group along? And when we deal with the specific conflict, because a lot of times you're not going to come to an ultimate resolution. And so sometimes it's best to kind of ignore it and say, you know what, we're not going to resolve this conflict in this group. And so let's move on. And as we grow through the group, I think we might hit on topics that will help us understand each other. And just allowing that to, at that moment, say, hey, we're not going to resolve this here. We don't have the skills. We don't, whatever you have to say as a therapist, and just kind of letting it go and moving forward. But
Is
again,
is that another way to kind of teach the group how to avoid conflicts as well?
yes, yeah, and again, you're modeling that, right? Because there is times when ignoring conflict is the best solution, right? Especially if someone is always getting engaged in conflict and it always ends up bad for them. So yes, that's a perfect example. You're modeling that process of when you can't come to a solution. Maybe it's time to, what's the saying? They say table it or put it on the back burner, I've heard. Um, so yes, thank you for bringing that up. Okay. Dealing with the conflict is when you can see areas where they can come together and understand each other. And we'll talk about that when we get to mediation and moderation, about identifying when clients are starting to connect with each other. Okay, so we'll talk about that when we get to those two topics. And these are some of the benefits of the course about addressing conflict, is it allows focus to remain on behavior, impact, consequences, process, and outcomes. This is the one thing that one of the issues of conflict that, again, I'll go back to modeling for your group members, is never trying to make it so the conflict itself is not personal. Okay. That in the beginning, they start attacking each other, right? And they start to personalize each other. Um, uh, and even what a term that we call in social psychology, dehumanize. Okay. And this is where an individual, if you've noticed in conflict, especially when there is a lot of fight in that conflict, you'll notice that they start to use dehumanizing terms, such as, and excuse my language, if you have kids in the room, please plug their ears, calling someone a dumbass. I want you to think about how dehumanizing that term is. Okay. Calling someone based upon their appearance, if they're overweight or if they look anorexic or something like that, and making the problem about that individual, but at the same time depersonalizing them and dehumanizing them. Okay. Um, I've even heard that sometimes during conflict, someone calling each other a dog or the other term for donkey. Um, uh, and so just one of the things, and the reason I'm bringing this up at this moment is when you start hearing those terms that are depersonalizing and dehumanizing, that's at the point where you want to just stop and put each other in their corners, do some breathing exercises, because once you start hearing that depersonalization and that dehumanization, there's not very much you can do. Okay, a very famous study, the Stanford prison studies, where someone who feels they're in power, but that power is ambiguous, and there's someone in a lack of power position that is also ambiguous. You start to this depersonalizing and this dehumanization process leads to outrage and hurting people very much. Okay. And so watch out for those kind of situations. Okay. Um, Encourage development versus defensiveness in saying, hey, we're going to grow from this. Resolving conflict is about growth and understanding of ourselves and a situation, and facilitate problem solving. Okay. This is where can we come to some common ground? What are some things we can do to reach some understanding of each other? And so in this last part, it's all about the words that you want to use. In the encourages and develops, it's about keeping in mind that conflict is about growth instead of uh, uh, um, defensiveness, I guess is the best word to use. And the other part of it is it's about facilitating problem solving and facilitating understanding of why we have this conflict. And in that, you also want to practice what's called normalization and openly say, hey, when this is important to understand because when people get to you two's stage that you're in of conflict, it's time to implement some skills, coping skills to deal with that situation. And just saying that you two are not the only two that have conflict over this issue. Okay. And normalizing that this is something that is human. Okay. And we can't really avoid it. This is some of the impacts of ignoring conflict. And as I mentioned before, there are times where you want to ignore the conflict and kind of move on because there's not going to be any resolution. But the point being is you try to find a solution first. Okay. When we talk about the impact of ignoring conflict, we're talking about the facilitator didn't even take the time to try and develop an understanding of conflict. Instead, right from the beginning, they just basically said, hey, you two settle down. We're going to move on to the next topic. That's not a healthy approach because what it happens is that it continues misunderstanding the situation between the two in probably a more human terms, a grudge is held that maybe before the facilitator interrupted, this facilitator allowed one person to give some final thoughts without bringing the other person's um, um, perspective at play before moving on. Damage of reputation, and this happens on two ends. One, it reflects you as the expert, as the professional, as the person who is supposed to be there to teach each group member how to deal with conflict. Okay. On the second end is the reputation of the two people who are um, 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 having the conflict, because there's going to be some group members who say, hey, I totally agree with you. That other person is totally wrong. They don't understand. They don't get it. And vice versa for that other person. Okay. If you ever have looked at conflict that happens in the office space, that's usually what happens, right? Is one person develops their little clique, the other person starts their only clique, and then the rumor mill starts to happen, and eventually it's affected the entire business or the entire team, even if they're not in either one of those cliques. Okay. So keep that in mind if you're just going to say in the beginning, we're going to ignore this. Okay. Impacts on teams or units. And so when we're talking about the group setting, And let's say we're having them do breakout rooms. I know that a lot of professors use breakout rooms in Zoom. It can create tension within those units, especially if you put the two people who are conflicting in the same unit. Okay. And of course, you can imagine from that, there's an impact on productivity. There's unspoken messages sent to the team, like, well, yeah, I think you all kind of understand these unspoken message when you have a person who acts offish, crosses and holds their arm whenever that person is talking, does snide faces whenever that other person is talking, and those kinds of things. Okay. The other part is that it slows down the group, and this is where it says position workplace satisfaction. The position of the group gets slowed down. You've just wasted a lot of time with your group because one, you don't um, do that conflict face on in the beginning. um, it can lower the satisfaction of your group members. And believe it or not, the reason why this also workplace satisfaction is into play is it affects your work satisfaction as a professional. And then that bleeds over into your working groups and to whoever you work with, where you start to say, you know what, I hate this group. And I have heard that in a lot of situations where they just come out of the group and say, I just cannot stand this group. They're always getting arguing. They're always just snide with each other. And then that tends to bleed over to other group facilitators. And then they start interacting with their group as if their group is also the same as the coworker. So kind of keep that in mind too when we think of this. Can anybody think of any other impacts of instantly ignoring conflict? Anybody else have any experience with that and what it can result in?
So just for clarification, it's when you intentionally ignore conflict in the group setting and how
Yeah,
it kind of worked against you.
yeah, and so it's not as much as ignoring it after you've tried to model that resolving it. And so you modeled the result, the conflict resolution, but there just is not a solution at that mind. So that's a healthy way. But when, as a group facilitator, or even just in any conflict, when you just completely ignore it and basically say, you two, calm down, sit down, we're going to move on. Does that make sense, Brenda?
Yeah, it is.
Do you have an
I,
example?
well, I was gonna share that when you have clients, I guess that are, in my experience, just those that come out of prison settings, they kind of have the criminal mentality still to, I guess, take over the group or run the group. And um, it's kind of more work to get them to stay on course that this is a treatment facility and not so much, I've heard the reference, trying to be alpha male of the group and um, just having to reiterate that you're here for treatment to work on yourself and not to, um, I guess, be the leader and run the facilities as was their mindset and behaviors while in the prison setting.
Brenda, I think that's a very beautiful example. And I just want to kind of build off of that is, again, when we're talking about a lot of individuals, especially coming out of prison and whatnot, one, they're usually ordered to be there, right? Especially when they're in the prison setting. They have to do it in order to get parole or something, or privileges within the prison or something to that remark. Okay. And speaking of what Brenda is talking about, in those situations, there are individuals that want to do the power play. And usually they want to do the power play with the therapist, but if it doesn't work with a therapist, they'll do it with the group members. Okay. And this is the thing that, again, I've talked about this. This is where, dependent upon the type of group you're working with and the type of individuals, and going back to that example of earlier, this is where you really want to take those backgrounds into account. Okay. And remember, always doing that self-reflection and self-awareness. Okay. The best example I have, speaking to Brenda's example, is when I did domestic violence offender groups. Okay. There was always one or two individuals in that that were at that play, that power play within the group setting. And the first people they do try to get to is the group facilitator, and they get to them by creating emotional reaction, emotional tone. And so in the domestic violence offender groups, they pick at the facilitator, uh, saying things like, "Oh, you think you know. Oh, you think you're an expert," or they do it very subtly. Um, and the moment they break the therapist, they go, "Ah, we've got this." Okay. Now I want you to think though about a lot of their histories. In the prison setting, you want to be the alpha person because you don't want to be the person who is taken advantage of. So it's a learned thing in the prison system that whatever interaction you want interact with, you want to be the alpha person. Okay. Now, I will say, and this is an example of situational influence, it's different in a women's prison. Okay. In men's prison, they develop more of what you would call a gang perspective, meaning that there's a leader of the gang and there's the enforcers of the gang, and so on. In women's prison, they do something that is more family oriented. They develop what you would call families, okay, where there is again kind of an alpha person that is called mother, but they go to mother not to get something enforced, but to look at her for advice. Okay. Now, the issue becomes in the female prison setting, and this is a big generalization, but I think it kind of gives an example of different approaches based on history and situation. If the mother is in the group setting, the individuals within that family system in that prison isn't going to look to the facilitator for approval or for continued advice. They're going to look at the mother. And that's where, again, in this type of situation, you have to then build that relationship with that individual that is in charge of that group. The same thing occurs in men's prisons. You have to understand where the power levels are, and you have to work at those different ones. But that is a beautiful example, Brenda, and a good example of kind of broad examples of differences based on people's gender, where they're at and the situation that they're in. All right. And again, I just want to emphasize this point. This is where, again, going back to emotional intelligence, we have to constantly be doing self-reflection and self-awareness, because sometimes we don't realize that we had an emotional response. But I guarantee you that person seeking that alpha level within a group sees every little emotional response you do and will take advantage of it. Okay. Um, Again, usually this occurs within groups that individuals are kind of forced to do. That there really there's no choice if they want to get paroled or if they want to not go to prison in the first place, such as diversion programs and those types of things. And so that's something to keep in mind. And Brenda, I really appreciate you bringing up that example. Is there any other things about ignoring conflict or whatnot where we're at this moment? Okay. So let's just continue on just for a few more minutes. So when we talk about the conversation, we're understanding what's going on. We're looking at the situation. I don't know why that says workplace. So this should say group behaviors. Sorry, I'm looking at the second bullet point in our slide. Interesting. There's two kind of conversations that we either want to have. One is what we call a critical conversation, excuse me. And the other one is called a challenging conversation. So a critical conversation is when conflict is based directly about the treatment, the way we're caring about treatment. So the skills that we're learning in conflict, in relapse prevention or trauma groups, and the conflict comes out of two different understandings about what's happening in the treatment setting. What should we be doing? Okay. And this results in bullying and disruptive group behavior. It should say group behavior there. And this kind of conflict usually occurs over multiple sessions. Okay. And it builds and builds over multiple sessions. Okay. And this is where, as the therapist, you want to manage these changes. You want to kind of keep an eye on it. And I used to keep notes that I'm noticing that these two have two different ideas and they're conflicting with each other. One has one view, one has another, and watch if it continues to develop. Okay. But this is an opportunity to have a critical conversation with your group members. Okay. Because no matter what, you take the same two individuals and you give them the same material, they're going to have probably two separate interpretations. All right. The place that this is experienced a lot is in college classes. All right. So for example, when I've asked an essay question on a test, normally I have a lot of varied ideas of what that question was asking. And the trick behind grading those is there common themes that you could derive out of what your students are learning to kind of then determine the grade that you're going to give. Okay. The same thing happens in the group setting. You can go over a very solid relapse prevention tool. One as simple as don't drive the same route you went home on every day, because that's then an avoidance technique that can lessen the potential of a relapse. Okay, very simple tool. Just take a different route home. But you're going to get probably a few people who understood the directions differently. One might understand it as take a different route home, meaning I'm doing this mentally. That when I'm driving my route home, I think about it different. I notice different things. The other one is going to take it very literally and say, well, I need to take this road instead of this road, and do a loop around to get to my house. And so there can be two different interpretations. I bring this up because this was actually a real example when I went through a group and tried to explain this concept. And this becomes an opportunity for a conversation, right? Because in this situation, we had a psychologically different route home. And in the other one, we had a literal definition. And that's a great opportunity to kind of combine those two things. Okay. Now, my example is more of a kumbaya, right? We came to a let's combine psychologically changing our mindset about driving home and physically changing the way we go home. Uh, and so it's not always going to be that easy, but I just want to use this basic example to kind of bring this example of critical conversations home. Challenging conversations are the type of conversations where that we often think about conflict resolution. This is again when members come in with a high and extreme visibility and outcomes and expectations for where they want to head. And this differs from different stakeholders within the group. This kind of goes back to Brenda's example, where there's that power play between group members. Okay. And group members' histories differ. Okay. So one person starts giving advice based on their experience. While that can be healthy, if it's done in a conflictual way, then it's something that has to be um, resolved. And then, of course, the treatment history challenges their contributors' inputs. Okay. Usually, when someone is in a group, it's usually not their first group. Okay. Usually people go into these with a history of some type, and understanding that history is important. Okay. And then, of course, emotions are running strong. And again, I'll go back to Brenda's input about when there's that power play within the group setting. Okay. And then, of course, in those challenging things, there's some ways that the person tries to um, um, deal with it. One is avoid, deflect, defend. The person with authority wins. The one that has the, biggest words, those types of things. Changing the conversation in middle of a sentence and grudges and gossip. Okay. These are all things that you want to look for as the facilitator. Are they holding grudges? Are they creating gossip during group breaks? Are they either interrupting a person in mid-sentence, or do they themselves go through and talk about something and realize they're going to about to say something counter to their strong opinion? Do they change the sentence completely? Do they change what they're talking about completely? Okay. And I think we've kind of talked enough about avoiding, deflecting, and defending, as especially when it deals with the authority situation. And I think this is when we're starting to get into conflict as a management tool and a way to get this. I want to just take home the physiological end of this is a lot of times in the conflict field, we talk about drunk on adrenaline, okay, where the body, its hormonal levels, the amygdala, which responds specifically to emotions of fear, create that flight, fright, or fight response. Okay. Now you usually hear it as flight and fight, but again, when we get to trauma-informed practices, we'll introduce more of this idea of fright. When people get scared and physiological, you'll see them kind of curl up into a fetal position and become very fearful. If it's extreme enough, they can't even be touched at that time. They have more of a trauma response if you go up and try to pat them on the back and get them to open up. And those kind of things. And we see this a lot with people who suffer from post-traumatic stress and those type of traumas. But we'll get more into that. Again, we'll come back to this when we get to trauma-informed responses. How do I feel about the person, the discussion, and the outcomes? Okay. Yes, I know I've said this over and over and over in this presentation. Self-awareness, self-reflection. because we all have opinions about different people based on their looks, their tone of voice, um, the way they talk. And as facilitators and therapists, we're not immune to those. And so understanding your role as a conflict manager, as we would say, is important because that may mean that you start to do things like favoritism towards one person or another. Okay. And is this the right time to have a discussion? Um, again, have I eaten, sleep deprivation? A lot of this comes from research on, like, for example, in court systems, and I may have mentioned this before too. The best time to go and have, if you do something and you want sentencing, you want to do it early in the morning or between 1 to about 3 p.m. Okay. Reason being is that's when judges tend to give the most lenient rulings. Okay. And what we have found is it really has to deal with that's when the judge is usually more awake because they've just eaten and they've just nutritioned themselves. Okay. Um, so we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to when conflict interacts with the therapist and the client. Okay. And sitting back and saying, gosh, am I prepared to have this conversation with this individual? Okay. All right. I think we should end here for today. So I'm going to stop sharing.